December 7th. Bruce talked about it, but what we teach our children, what's in the movies, is that that was a surprise attack. And if you know the history, you know that the conflict had started well before December 7th. And that oftentimes the wars we end up in start well before the shooting starts, and sometimes arrive on our doorsteps, even though we don't want them to. How's that? So I'm going to tell you about 3 wars that shaped my life and brought me here to be with you today. The first of the 3 wars is Vietnam. And I know right now you're thinking, no, you're not old enough. No, I was not old enough. But my grandfather was a provincial administrator in the South Vietnamese government. And in April of 1975, when the South fell, my grandfather turned to my grandmother and the 11 children that they had, and my grandfather said, "Get the children out of the country." So there's a whole story that my father can tell about walking from Hue, the 600 miles to Saigon, with my grandmother dropping children off along the way. Can you get on that ship? Can you get on that plane? And I'll tell you about that over a beer or a cup of coffee, but it ends with my father and his siblings as refugees in Seattle as children. And you can only understand the stories that I'm about to tell if you know that my father and mother were teenagers. I'm talking 15 when they had me. By the time I was a year old, my father, he grew up in a combat zone, right? So PTSD, maybe some alcohol, maybe some drugs. He was gone. And my 15-year-old single mother and I, well, my mom did the best she could. She could, by the time I was 7, was a deal that sounded like, "Ryan, you need to get yourself up. Get yourself fed, get yourself to school, get yourself home, do your homework, make your dinner, do the dishes, and put yourself to bed." And I was good with almost all of that. I could actually fry a pretty mean pork chop and splash some orange juice on it, and I thought that I was a gourmet chef. The hardest part, though, was the putting myself to bed. At 7 years old and consistently alone, I was so afraid that I would leave all the lights on in the apartment. And I would grab the chef's knife, the big 7-inch chef's knife from the kitchen, and I would climb under my bed where I had put cardboard boxes around all of it except for the last 2 feet. And I'd climb in and fall asleep under there with the 7-inch chef's knife, and then wake up in the morning and do it all over again. It was a dark time for me. I was lonely. I was afraid. But looking back on it, the worst of it was feeling weak, and particularly in a room full of men, feeling weak, and for me, leading to a feeling of shame. I'm going to talk about that weakness, but it takes me to heroes. I want you to think back to when you were 7, about the men that were in your life, about your heroes that you looked up to. And some of you might be thinking of your father or coach. I'm thinking about mine. They are the A-Team, the Dukes of Hazzard, Chips, Knight Rider, and Pete Mitchell from Top Gun. And there were some real characters, too, that I watched who were strong and who I admired. Ronald Reagan and Colin Powell. And so While I didn't have men in my life growing up that I could watch at the dinner table, I watched Ronald Reagan and Colin Powell, and they taught me two lessons that I carried with me for a long time. Ronald Reagan famously said, I think of the Russians mostly, trust but verify. I heard it, yep. And Colin Powell, his doctrine was, bring overwhelming force to anything that you need to do so that you can be virtually assured that you are in control of the outcome. Trust but verify, and overwhelming force. These are the lessons that I took from my heroes. And so I applied that overwhelming force at school because that's where I got love and affection and approval. By the time I made it to senior year of high school, my relationship with my mom had started to falter. She was living with a boyfriend, and I was sleeping in my car or staying with friends. I would never stay with a friend more than one night in a row, so that I could always go back to that friend's house the next night if I had an emergency. I felt like that way I didn't overstay my welcome. The light in my life those days was a woman named Mrs. Tower. She was the college counselor for our school, but she was also my academic advisor, and she took attendance for me and a dozen other kids in the morning. And in the morning, senior year, she would greet me with, Ryan, where'd you sleep last night? And it was a joke for all 13 of us that were in that homeroom. And it sounds like she might have been making fun of me. But she wasn't. And there's a story I can tell you over a beer, a cup of coffee, about 20 years later when she came to check on me again. But she was watching over me. And she was loving on me from a distance. And it was the one time of the day that I knew that I was going to hear my name called. Mrs. Tower created that thin space for me every day, that thin space where heaven feels a little bit closer to earth. And with her help, and that application of overwhelming force to the thing that actually gave me a sense of satisfaction, academics, I was blessed to be granted a nomination and acceptance into the Naval Academy. And so off I went. And I said I'd talk about 3 wars. So that was the Vietnam War helping me to come to existence. And the next war is the Iraq War. So it starts at the Naval Academy. And at this point, I'll take a sidebar and just say, because sometimes people ask this question. It was at the Naval Academy that I came to Christ. One of the great things about our nation and great things about our military is respect for the freedom to worship and investment in the chaplain corps in our military. It's not for recruiting. It's not for pushing. It's for investing in the spiritual health of those who go to serve. And I made a friend of a chaplain who was serving at the Naval Academy, and he mentored me and discipled me into baptism and confirmation. The other thing I'll say about this being the greatest country on the face of the planet is that for the 7-year-old kid who used to sleep under his bed and go to school senior year and hope just somebody would say his name, to give me the ability to go to school, to pursue a dream, and then after the Naval Academy, for them to send me to graduate school. Bruce mentioned it. They sent me to Harvard. In the Marine Corps, we refer to it as the H word because it's not cool in the Marine Corps. They sent me to Harvard for a master's in economics. I use it to this day in business transformation. But the greatest thing that happened to me at Harvard, the biggest blessing in my life, is sitting at the front table. My wife Jessica is here with us today. She's been with me for 23 years. And she doesn't like it when I remind her of this story, but when we were dating, we were talking about what my life was going to look like in the Marine Corps, moving around, deployments, and she said, she's shaking her head, because she's like, I didn't say this. She said, if flying fighters in the Marine Corps is what will make you happy, then that's what I want for you too. And I knew then that I was the luckiest guy on the planet. And I know that now too. And it hasn't been an easy road. There's been a dozen moves. Pack up the house, move to someplace you didn't sign up for. Our first move was to Barstow, California. The people laughing have been there. This was, honey, welcome to the Marine Corps. It was also, I will tell you, that the trust but verify when applied to authority figures, if you end up verifying that you can't trust the authority figure and then you behave in that way, you end up getting punished with orders to Barstow, California. But we packed up and we went to Barstow and we started a tradition. When we move, we fly to where we're going. We go to where we think we're going to live, and we drive to all the important things. We drive to Starbucks. We drive to Target. We drive to the grocery store. Later in life, we would drive to the schools. We would get a feel for what life would be like at this new place. We've done it a dozen times now. But that first one in Barstow felt like a punishment. The thing was, I got to do business transformation at a remanufacturing depot as one of two Marines there as the only finance officer. It was an experimentation laboratory for me in leadership and business that I didn't know was going to pay off for me. It felt like a punishment, but it was truly a blessing. And an even bigger blessing is that Jessica and I got to spend a couple of years. I mean, those of you that laughed, right? There is nothing to do. And by the way, the people in Barstow will say, no, that's great. It's a 3-hour drive to anything. Anything you want. Skiing, Las Vegas, the beach, it's all within 3 hours. So we made it out of Barstow. And at this point, I'll jump. I'm talking about the Iraq War, right? So 2 flying stories for you. And with the first one, so both of these are my time in Iraq, deployed with a Hornet squadron to Iraq. And our mission, for the most part, was to support SEALs and Delta Force on the ground who would go pull insurgents out of their beds in the middle of the night. They'd play a game of high-stakes Red Rover, send your insurgent over. And if the insurgent came out, then they would bag him up and take him away, and our work was done for the night. And if the insurgent didn't come out, then we were there to up the ante, with 500-pound bombs raining from the sky. So, the first story. There's 4 things you need to know for this story to make sense. 4 things about the F-18 Hornet. First, for those that don't have the picture, it's 2 engines, 2 twin tails in the back. The 2 engines mean that you have 2 hydraulic systems. That way, if you lose one, you got the other one. The hydraulic systems are what make the controls move. Without the controls, the thing is a flying brick. So you need at least 1 hydraulic system of the 2. It also has 2 radios. We call them the front radio and the back radio. The front radio we use to talk to air traffic control or in a combat zone to the controllers that are moving us from one place to another. The back radio we use for help. We use it to talk to our wingman. In an emergency, we can dial up the squadron frequency and talk to a pilot that's on duty with a radio and the emergency procedures book. That's the back radio. And then lastly, the fourth thing you need to know for this story to make sense is night vision goggles. They were not invented for the fighter cockpit. They clip to the front of your helmet with a bracket that's been made by a fifth grader. And if you eject with goggles on your forehead, it'll snap your neck. And if you take an arrested landing, so there's arrested landings on carriers, we also have those wires at military bases if there's an emergency, right? If you take an arrested landing in either of those places with goggles in front of your eyes, it throws your face so far forward that the goggles will break your nose. And so this first story from Iraq, I was supporting the SEALs who had finished up their business for the night. They were on a convoy going back to their base, and I got a hydraulic system failure, which means I'm flying on one. And the book says that's an emergency, go home. Because if you lose the second one, you're going to fall out of the sky. But here was this convoy of SEALs, and they're risking their lives in a combat zone, and I thought, well, I'm already here, so I'll just stay. Stayed and covered them for an hour, and as soon as they cleared the gate, I came up on the radio and I said, I got a hydraulic failure. I think I need to head home now. So I did what we did. The standard operating procedure was dial up on that back radio, the one that you use to radio for help. I called up my squadron. I said, I got a hydraulic failure. I know that I need to take an arrested landing because without the second hydraulic system, you can't steer the nose wheel. You can hit the ground, but then you're like Santa's sled. So I'm coming back to base with the tail hooked down, ready to take an arrested landing. And my friend Nancy, so Nancy's his call sign. Unlike the movies, Navy and Marine Corps call signs are not cool. Nancy's last name was Reagan. So I get my friend Nancy on the back radio. He understands what's going on, and he says, okay, I'm breaking out the book. And he starts reading me the emergency procedures. And so it didn't surprise him to find out later what I'd done. I did what my personality would drive me to do in a single-seat cockpit, and I reached up to the back radio, and I turned it all the way down and just let him read to nobody because I had it. I didn't need his help. And I was on short final, like here to the doors, ready to catch a wire, and I heard a scream come through the back radio. Nancy had figured it out. I had dialed him all the way down, and he screamed through the back radio, there's my call sign, Bilbo, Bilbo, goggles. And I had time to reach up and grab them and tuck them under my leg and grab the controls and catch the wire. And my face was this far from the panel. And he saved me from a broken face that night and knew that he needed to scream because he knew that I had just turned him all the way down. The second story, flying in Iraq. Okay, two more things you need to understand about the Hornet. On the bottom of the Hornet, it's got 60 flares. Those flares can deceive heat-seeking missiles. The flares are there in case you see the missile coming up at you, and then you can dispense them one at a time, hoping to trick the seeker head into biting off on one of the flares instead of your airplane. You can also dispense all 60 flares in an emergency. If you knew you were going to make an arrested landing in a puddle of fuel, you could salvo all 60 flares while still airborne. That's an important detail because I had done that in California just to see what it would look like. And my skipper found out. And the commanding officer knew that I had just jettisoned $12,000 worth of flares just to see the light show. So just keep that in mind. So it was 2008, June. My skipper and I were flying a mission in support of the SEALs up near the Syrian border. And he came up on the radio after an hour of orbiting over these SEALs. And he said, "Did you just dump your flares?" Like in a combat zone. Like, I did it in California, but I'm not that dumb. And after a couple times back and forth, for me trying to figure out why he would even ask that, he explained in a few words that he had just seen the heat-seeking missile that had been fired at me, that the seeker head we assess had not cooled enough to keep locked on me, drift behind me, and then, as they're programmed to do, explode when it got to its max altitude. Now, the other thing here is we were flying 4,000 feet above the max altitude of heat-seeking missiles, but we were also flying over a 4,000-foot mountain range, and those guys were smart that night. They climbed up to the top of the 4,000-foot mountain range, and they were launching them at us from the top. So my skipper said what any combat pilot would say. He said, "Let's work to the south." And what he meant was, let's slide our circle 1 mile to the south, which means absolutely nothing to a heat-seeking missile. But we did it anyway. And then here's the thing. In a gigantic circle in support of guys on the ground, it takes about 4 minutes in a fighter to do a complete circle. And so every 4 minutes for the next 50 turns, I turned my tailpipes to that mountain range with nothing but a prayer that I wasn't going to find out that another heat-seeking missile had found my airplane. And at this point in my life, in my relationship with God, my first prayer, I remember it distinctly, was, "Lord, let me see the next one come up so that I can kill this guy." And they didn't get much more Christian as the night went on. They did get a little softer. 49 prayers later, I think I had arrived at, "Lord, I get it. Let your will be done. If you're going to split the airplane in two, just give me a second to get on the ejection handle." It wasn't surrender. It might have been submission. But that's where I was in my relationship with God in a combat zone. All right. I told you 3 wars. Talk about Vietnam, talk about Iraq. Let me talk about the 3rd war that brings me to be standing here talking to you today. It's not Afghanistan. It's the war within. And by the war within, I'm referring to the negative emotions, the negative behaviors that kept me, that keep all of us from being able to feel God's love. I'm talking about fear and anxiety and worry and depression and anger and frustration and guilt and hatred and shame. And I'm talking about negative behaviors like laziness or selfishness or lust, or the isms, alcoholism, or this one may hit with some of you, careerism. Those things get in our way of feeling God's love, and that is what I mean when I refer to the 3rd war, the war within. My personal favorite, it's not really a good thing, but my personal favorite is anger. It's been that way for a long time. Probably nurtured by Hey, bring overwhelming force to any fight that you need to be in and just control the situation. Nurtured by trust, but verify, especially when applied to your relationship with God. It doesn't work out that well. These things are also insidious. They creep up on you. It's a powerful thing to be talking about this on December 7th, when we're talking about a surprise attack that we knew we were in conflict, and yet we waited until it was on our doorstep. By the time I had retired from the Marine Corps, it was 2014, got an amazing job working at a top-tier management consulting firm. We were living in a big house. We weren't moving around anymore. It should have been, by all measures, the definition of success, definitely the definition of the American dream. But I was in such a bad place. In particular, I think the loss of identity, the uniform, the flight suit, that's a tangible thing that veterans can talk about, but everybody in the experience it. The loss of a job, the loss of a role, the loss of respect in some form, that loss for me was crippling. We were in a bad place with relationships, with people that we hadn't carefully curated, people that did not shine light into our lives, people whose words were not the words that we should have been listening to. And so when Jessica and I came to Austin on a weekend visit, and we got home, and Jessica said, "What do you think about retiring to Austin?" I was nowhere near retirement, but I do work remotely, and so I said, well, why wait? So we did what we always did. We got on a plane, we flew here, and we drove to all the important places. The grocery store, the girls' potential schools. Only this time, we did something different. In response to what we felt like, Brandon Puffer from last month called it a God-sized hole in your heart. We scheduled some time at a church here in the area, and we met with the staff. We went in and said, "Where do you live?" And we said, "Atlanta." And the staff said, "Well, when are you moving here?" And we said, "We're not sure yet if we're even moving." And they said, "Well, what can we help you with?" And we said, "We're here to figure out whether or not we're supposed to be here, and that's why we're talking to you." And the poor staff did the best they could to ask us what we were looking for and to pray for us. But then we described what we were really missing. Intimate, genuine relationships with people who want to share their lives with us, even the bad things. To celebrate the good things, to commiserate on the bad things, to hold one another up, that we wanted that. And then came the 8 words that changed my life. And right about now, you're thinking the words are something like, "Come on, we have that." That's definitely what I was thinking. But no, the 8 words are, "You may need to help us build that." I got goosebumps just now hearing the words again, because it wasn't what Jessica and I wanted to hear. We wanted to hear, "Come on, it's waiting for you." And so that was July 19th of 2019. And I know the date, and I'm just going to say, if you were at Fix downtown at dinner that night and were distracted by the couple crying and whispering, that was us. I'm sorry. But if there was ever a moment that I can point to that is surrender in my life to God's will, it was that night at Fix, hearing him say, not, come on, I got this, but you may need to help me build that. So spoiler alert, we're here, right? One more thing, though, that I want to talk about. We'd been here for about a year, and we had some friends from church tell us, hey, we'd like to keep the girls for a weekend. Mind you, this is like at the end of COVID, so we haven't been away from our children more than about 15 feet in a year. And we said, yes. And then they said, so that you can go to this weekend and spend a weekend thinking about your relationship with God. And some of you have, Catholics call them Curcio, Methodists call them Walk to Emmaus, pilgrimage, Kairos, if you're in prison, it's available for you, right? Celebration for your kids that go to Westlake freshman year. We jumped at the opportunity. And I got to admit, it was the first time that I'd spent more than 45 minutes. Because if you go to church for an hour, right, 15 minutes on the front end is, just getting into things. It's the first time in my life I'd spent more than 45 minutes in a row thinking about my relationship with God. My involvement as a participant and then serving with the people that serve in that ministry has changed my life and brought me joy that I didn't know could exist. I don't know if Jessica knows this, but when our first daughter, Ella, was born, I know you know that I cried. I don't know if you know that those were tears of fear and anxiety and worry. And I've heard stories about fathers who cried tears of joy when their kid was born. And I thought, there must be something wrong with me. But this life turn that we've made for ourselves to be deliberate about forming a Christian community around ourselves, this dumping out of our pack and starting over, has been a gift from God for us. Out of that, I just want to acknowledge a couple of guys that were supposed to be here today, but got called, one by his daughter who needs to move from college and one that needs to be in work. But my Tuesday morning group, Clint and Jody and Mike, I know that right now they're thinking about us. I know they're praying for me. I'm laughing because I think their prayer is, Lord, Ryan, please not mess this up. But I love that I have guys in my life, guys in this room, who will walk with me. So, that third war, that war within, there's two truths about it. The first one is, if it hasn't arrived on your doorstep yet, it will. And the second truth about the war within is, you don't have to do it alone. So in a couple of minutes, Tom's going to get up and close. And it'll be a soft close, and you don't have to pay anything for lunch. But I am going to give you a call to action. And there's a couple of things that I'm going to ask of you for the price of admission. If any of my story resonates with you, the desire for genuine relationships, for men who walk with you, if you're suffering, the feeling of identity loss that I was feeling when I hung up my uniform, if your life's in turmoil, if you're trying to stuff it down and ignore it, if you feel what may be a God-sized hole in your heart, three things. The first one is, It's about strangers. So at your table right now, I'm guessing there's probably somebody that you don't know. Definitely somebody that you don't know well. It might be them. It might be somebody else across the room, or it might be somebody who's not even here, but somebody in the next week or two or month is going to reach out to you and say, hey, you want to grab a cup of coffee? And my call to action for you is say yes for the sake of having brothers who will come up on the back radio for you. Say yes. And then here's the thing, not because you need it, but because you might be their gift that day. All right, that's number one. Number two is consider a reset. And I get it. I mean, you're all here in Austin. I'm here in Austin. People like being in Austin. I don't want you to move. Not everybody has a wife who says, let's go 600 miles and start over. So from the bottom of my heart, consider taking a weekend. Whatever form that looks like for you, take a couple of days and really spend some time thinking about your relationship with God. And if a weekend isn't achievable, and dumping out your pack entirely with a move is not on the table, then think about one rock. One of those unhealthy emotions that you go to, mine is anger. One of those unhealthy behaviors that you go to, commit to dumping out one of those rocks and replace it with 1 hour a week. I did the math. It's less than 1% of your 1 hour a week where you intentionally seek the face of God. And what I mean when I say intentionally seek the face of God is if you're comfortable with it, if devotional is your thing, do that. If that's not your thing, then it counts if it's just have a cup of coffee with a friend. Share your love with that friend. All right, that's number two. And then lastly, for the guys, so strangers, now I'm going to talk about guys that you know, guys that you may love, guys that love you back. That night in Iraq for me, when I turned Nancy all the way down, is a life lesson for me and is connected to this last thing that I'm going to ask of you today. For those that you love, turn up the radio. It may not be that somebody's trying to help you. It may be you that's reading the emergency procedures for them. I want to thank you all for letting me be here today. It's an honor and a privilege, and I thank you for your attention.